So first and foremost, I want to thank all of you for being here. These days especially, it's not as easy to get around DC as it could be, and so the effort you have made to be here in person, I greatly appreciate. But I'd also like to welcome the individuals who are not here in person but are tuning in, hopefully, via WebEx Live. My name is Charlotte Hudson, and I direct the Lenfest Ocean Program. The mission of the program is to fund policy-relevant scientific research. We're motivated by the concept that research is more likely to be considered in policy and management discussions if it directly affects and directly informs the decision-maker's needs. To identify potential research topics, we engage with stakeholders about the needs in their communities. Once a grant is awarded, we continue to facilitate discussions between the grantees and the interested parties about the funded research projects and the research results. So 2 years ago, we supported Dr. Timothy Essington and Dr. Phil Levin, both now at the University of Washington. We convened this group of people and charged them with pulling together a group of people made up of experts, scientists, and practitioners to draft a practical and flexible blueprint that managers could use to implement ecosystem-based fisheries management. Alongside the task force, they assembled an advisory panel comprised of past and present fisheries managers from around the world, NOAA scientists, stakeholders, and others who provided guidance throughout the project and reviewed their findings. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Essington and Dr. Levin, as well as a panel who are on the front lines of implementing many of these measures around the country. After a few comments by Dr. Essington, Dr. Levington and the panel will join us up here and hear from them about their perspectives from the representative institutions that they come from. And then we'll open the floor to questions. So I look forward to hearing more from all of you, and thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you also. I want to say thank you for coming. I'm super excited to talk about the work that has been going on for 2.5 years or so with a large number of people, and we're pretty excited about these results and to share them with you today. Just saw Katie, I want to say hi. I just want to start with a few just sort of observations before we get into kind of the details of what the task force recommendations were. We're going to be talking a lot about these things called fishery ecosystem plans. Essentially, they're the counterpoint to the fishery management plans that the councils are already regularly using. And at first, I just want to acknowledge that the idea of a fishery management plan is not new. We did not invent this. This is an idea that's been around for 16 or 17 years. But what we wanted to do was take a closer look at the fishery ecosystem plans, and what we're creating is what we're calling the next generation of fishery ecosystem plans. And the motivation behind that was when we looked around at the existing work that had been done to do fishery ecosystem planning, we found while they were extensive documents that detailed fishery systems, they often didn't lead to action. And that was our fundamental charge, was really how do we take the ideas and principles of ecosystem-based fisheries management and put them into practice. So we're going to be talking about these next generation fishery ecosystem plans as the tool to go from principles to action. That's never good. Okay, it was a dark time. We're going to do this backwards. Avert your eyes, please. Okay, here I am. Boom, okay. Nope. Here we go. Real quick, just to give you a flavor of what the task force was and what we tried to do, we put together a very diverse team of experts whose disciplinary training and expertise range from anthropology to economics to ecology to fishery science to modeling, and also people that were from all over the United States. And also from various places around the world. So we had people from Australia, Europe, and Canada also participating in this. In addition, Charlotte mentioned the advisory board, who was outstanding in making sure that we didn't drift off into academic la-la land, and we stayed sort of firmly grounded in reality. And our approach was to have essentially this sort of traveling roadshow where we went around to different parts of the United States and talked to people. And the people that we talked to were people that were involved in the council process. That might have been a council staff, it could have been members of the SSC, they could be stakeholders, or they could be NOAA scientists that were deeply engaged in fisheries management. And through these conversations, what we did is we asked them what is it they would like to achieve that they're having a hard time achieving, and most importantly, what are some of the barriers that they're facing that we thought we could overcome through our recommendations of a fishery ecosystem plan. So I'm just going to start with the main findings, just in case people drift off. The first is this idea of going from principles to action, this operationalization of ecosystem-based fisheries management, really can't be done without a structured planning process that's specifically designed to lead to action. Our second key finding is that fishery ecosystem plans can be conducted right now, this afternoon if we want, with existing science and policy tools. Fishery ecosystem plans are also a perfect venue for integrating and jointly trying to achieve social, economic, and ecological goals for fishery systems. And then lastly, fishery ecosystem plans are a really useful tool for promoting transparency in decision making, and especially for flagging trade-offs that are inherent in the fishery system. So now I'll back up and tell you a little bit how we got to those recommendations. So what I'm going to sort of talk about for the rest of the time up here before we have our panel discussion is essentially give the task force vision of what EBFM really is, ecosystem-based fisheries management, and then talk about a process that we think can be applied for fishery ecosystem plans that will achieve these things that we've talked about. So we'll start with this first thing. What is ecosystem-based management in the task force vision? And our group took a very broad definition of ecosystem-based fisheries management. It's the idea that you start with the place in which the fishery is operating, and you look at the system in which that fishery is embedded. And that fishery consists, of course, of a biophysical system that, of course, includes the biology and the climate and environmental forcing and habitats. It includes the human component of the fishery system as well. So the interactions among different fishery fleets, fishery-dependent communities, cultural values, and how processors fit into the whole thing. And then lastly, it also considers the governance system as well. And that can be fairly simple in some cases, or in other cases can be fairly complex, spanning federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions. So this is the overall framework from looking at a fishery and the context for making fishery decisions. So in other words, rather than looking at just at the fishery and then thinking about that, we think about the components of the fishery system and the linkages as our framework for decision making. Now, based on this, and based on our conversations, what we saw is what really needed was a real formalized, structured process for trying to put into practice some of the principles of ecosystem-based fisheries management. But to do this, we wanted to go forward being cognizant of some, real serious sort of barriers or contexts for decision making. And the first is that no one told us that they had a lot of free time that they were trying to get rid of. Everyone is already extraordinarily busy. There's a lot of work they're already doing. Council agendas are already stuffed. So we wanted to make recommendations that would complement and hopefully streamline activities that are already being done, rather than adding on to existing workloads. The second observation is that fishery systems are inherently very, very complex. There are a lot of different components, there are a lot of different linkages, and those components and linkages are constantly changing. So we need to have a framework to deal with this complexity and also to deal with the uncertainty that comes along with this uncertainty. And lastly, we wanted to make recommendations that were consistent with the ways in which policies actually get made. So we wanted to make sure that our guidelines would fit into the current fishery management system and would be consistent with all of the guiding legal statutes. So that said, what I'm going to talk about now is essentially a generic planning framework that we've essentially adopted, but viewed through the lens of operationalizing ecosystem-based fisheries management. So what I'm going to do is going to take you through these different steps and then talk a little bit about some of the different components of those steps. Okay, the first step of the fishery ecosystem plan is simply asking, where are we now? It's asking, well, what is my fishery system? What are the components? How are they linked together? What might be indicators that might judge the status of that system? And importantly, what are the sort of the key threats that I ought to be considering for my fishery system? So those threats could be things like climate change. It could be loss of habitat. It could be market forces that are changing the profitability of the fleet. There could be changes in the demographic makeup of the fleet. All those different things might be relevant threats. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this step because when we looked around the sort of the landscape, we see that people are actually doing this step really, really well right now. So this is one area where the regional councils have done a really, really good job. So once you understand what your system is, then you start asking questions, well, where do we want to go? And just like any planning process, that starts with a high-level vision of what it is that we want as a good fishery system, and translating those into a series of strategic objectives that correspond to desired outcomes relevant to all the different dimensions of fisheries, from economic, social, and ecological. A key piece here in this step is because fishery systems have so much complexity and there's so many potential issues that a fishery ecosystem plan could address, this is the key step where you have to do some sort of prioritization. In other words, we can't possibly solve all problems at once. This is the step where we figure out which problems are we going to prioritize and identify for action for this particular iteration of a fishery ecosystem plan. And without this, we'll sort of continue to be mired in the complexity of fishery systems. And that prioritization process can build in any one of a number of processes like risk assessment or vulnerability assessment. Once that's done, then you have a clear set of very specific objectives that you're then trying to achieve, realizing you're not capturing every single thing that could possibly be done. So now you know specifically what you want to get done, and the next step is to ask, well, how are we possibly going to do that? And there's a number of important activities associated with this particular step. Obviously, you need to identify the performance measures. So what would a successful outcome look like? And that involves flagging what are the metrics, and then what are the benchmarks that you're trying to achieve. And those benchmarks could be specific levels you're trying to reach, the levels you're trying to avoid, or it could just be trends you're trying to get in those indicators. It then becomes an incredibly important step of engaging with a very broad group of stakeholders, including policymakers, scientists, people involved in the fishing industry, people involved representing a wide range of interests, to devise a bunch of different alternative strategies that might successfully achieve those objectives. And then, of course, comes a screening process where you then judge the likely performance of those various performance strategies for every single performance measure. And what comes out of that are two super duper important things. The first is you're going to identify some particular strategies that people thought were a good idea that everyone says, you know what, this one actually across the board doesn't do very well. And that's really good, important to know. But secondly, and critically, it's also going to flag just fundamental trade-offs in the fishery system. Because we all know it's impossible to maximize everything. So it sort of lays bare these fundamental trade-offs that the decision maker can then sort of wrestle with. At that point, it's sort of the usual implementation and monitoring steps. So we want to know what the costs are going to be. We need to know if we need to make regulation change, how that's going to happen, what's the time frame, and how we're going to do monitoring. And then finally, at the very end, we asked, well, did we make it? Did we achieve the things that we sought out to do? And this entire process is an iterative one. It's an adaptive process that learns from the experiences so that policies are continually updated as we learn more and more about the system through the implementation of particular policies. And this learning and adjusting loop happens at two scales. It happens at the broad overall. If I had a pointer that would work, I would show the broad circular thing happening. But over the life of a plan, say 10 or 12 years or so, that sort of represents that outer loop of this diagram. And then you see these little smaller loops, and those are sort of shorter term adjustments to the policy as you start getting some sense of how your policy is working and making adjustments kind of on the fly. So that's our basic framework that we're recommending as a blueprint for fishery ecosystem plans to follow what we call the fishery ecosystem plan loop. Now, one thing that we feel really strongly about is that this process overcomes a lot of the perceived barriers to implementing ecosystem-based management. So people have flagged things like the complexity of systems and or uncertainty about systems and the cost of doing this and the lack of clear objectives as a real barrier. And our fishery ecosystem plan essentially surgically tackles every single one of those elements. Two key considerations for actually doing this. The first is that stakeholder participation is incredibly important throughout this entire process. Coming up with the objectives can't be done purely by policymakers. It needs a broader coalition of stakeholders involved. And even the identification of different strategies, even judging the likely outcomes, requires a lot of involvement. And the last thing that's super important is that we found that the existing science tools and existing policy tools are already capable of achieving most of the things that we're talking about. We can have very complex science tools or science tools that can be applied in relatively data-poor situations can still be brought to bear to support this process. And the policy instruments that we already use today can simply be modified and used in novel combinations to reach broader systemic goals. Now this all sounds kind of great, but we also wanted to ask whether this was even achievable. So what we did is we looked at a wide range of case studies around the world. These were not randomly selected at all, but instead they were case studies that members of the task force had a lot of experience in. And what we simply did is took those case studies where there's some sort of ecosystem-based fisheries issue, and then we simply looked at what activities happened through the lens of our fishery ecosystem plan and asked, well, what activities have already been done? And we came up with this big chart that looks like this. The columns is just the different case studies, and every row is just a different step of our FEP loop. The key thing to pay attention to is where are the blue squares. The blue square simply means that's where we found obvious evidence of that particular step happening. And there are three key points from this particular slide. The first is that no case study was the grand champion of ecosystem-based fisheries management and had done every single step that we had described. But that said, if you look in aggregate, almost every single step has been done somewhere by somebody. So none of the things that we've suggested are things that are just not possible. But the one exception is the one that's, you probably can't see, it's right in the middle, and it's the prioritization step. And that doesn't mean necessarily people didn't do prioritization, but it was really hard for us to find evidence that like a clear prioritization process happened. So we flagged that as one real low-hanging fruit of something that can be done relatively quickly to really make a pretty big advance in terms of operationalizing ecosystem-based fisheries management. So in closing, why do we think councils should be excited about doing fishery ecosystem plans? First is that they're a vehicle to go from broad ecosystem principles into action and hopefully lead to better outcomes. We can do it. We don't need to wait for future science tools or future policy tools. It's going to help us achieve our goals of triple bottom line sustainability. And ideally, it'll help decision makers in choosing among trade-offs by better reflecting the trade-offs inherent in the fisheries system. Okay, so that's our quick summary of our report. What I'm going to do now is ask our panel to come up here, and I'm going to hand it over to our co-chair, Phil Levin, who's going to introduce the panel.
You have to turn on your microphone. Did you turn them on?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, I'm Phil Levin. And let me, you're scaring me back there. Let me thank everybody again for coming out. I really appreciate everybody's attendance and especially the participation of our fine panelists today. So let me tell you who's here. I'm Phil, as I just said. This is Harvey Kitka. Harvey is a retired salmon fisherman from Sitka, Alaska. He's a member of the Sitka tribe. And I know Harvey from doing extensive work with herring and trying to incorporate traditional knowledge into ecosystem management of herring. Michelle Duval is from the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. And she's very active in the South Atlantic
Fisheries Management
Council. And then we have Richard Merrick, who probably everybody knows. Rich, you know, everywhere, including on TV. Richard is the Chief of Science for the NOAA Fisheries and the Strategic Scientific Advisor or something like that. He's, the big.
Okay.
The big wig. So what I'm going to do is we've had some questions prepared to sort of tee off a discussion, and then we'll open it up for everyone else. And the first question is for me. Phil, can you tell us a little bit more about the role of the advisory panel? And I just wanted to quickly emphasize the importance of the advisory panel to our process. So as Tim said and Charlotte said, we had this advisory panel made up of current and former council members as well as some stakeholders. We also had a group of liaisons to NOAA that allowed us to coordinate our efforts with the actions going on in NOAA. So, and as Tim alluded to, and I just want to stress the importance of this idea that it wasn't a bunch of academics operating in a vacuum. The advisory panel reviewed critically everything that we did and really, I think, made incredible contributions to the final product. I think I was absolutely amazed at their engagement and their willingness to spend time. They're incredibly busy people, and they were really generous, and it really improved the product. So I just wanted to give the shout out to them. Richard, I wanted to ask you, since I mentioned coordinating with NOAA, we know that there is a NOAA EBFM policy now and a roadmap, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and how you see these two activities intersecting.
Well, let me say, first of all, that NOAA's been talking about this since at least the Clinton administration. We don't seem to have made much progress. I've reflected back on what we've done in the last 5 years and how we got to where we are now. Because we rolled out an EBFM policy for the first time. Actually, NOAA takes a stand on EBFM this summer, and we're about to roll out the roadmap for implementing it on Thursday, I think. And we've gotten there because we've had some really hard-working people from headquarters. Some of them are in the audience here. As well as I was fortunate enough to be able to hire 3 senior scientists who actually I think wound up being advisors. So I have a senior scientist for economics, Doug Lipton. So he's been making sure that people keep talking about the social science part of this, which people frequently forget about. Rick Mathot on stock assessments, but most importantly I think is Jason Link, who should actually be the person here talking. Because between Jason and Heather Sager, who's over here, they actually carried this through all the arguments and discussions that occurred within NOAA, within our partners that we worked with to deal with this. Because coming up with a policy seems like something very simple, but actually to state that we do indeed define what EBFM is and that we're going to support it was a big deal. It took us, when I first mentioned this to Jason, right after he got the job 4 years ago, it was like, we don't have a policy on this, we should say something. And it took us 3 years to get to that point. And now the roadmap is even bigger. It's easy to state what we want to do, but actually to come up with a roadmap how we're going to get there is a really big deal. And that rolls out Thursday.
Thanks, Richard. Harvey, I'm wondering, just listening to Richard speak and Tim also, sort of this idea that EBFM has been percolating for a long time, and one of the key parts of EBFM is thinking about trade-offs. And I know you've thought a little bit about trade-offs in your own fishery, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs you've experienced.
Well, some of the trade-offs I saw, and probably most of them are not really that great. One of the things I've basically lived on the ocean for almost all my life. I was raised as the son of a commercial fisherman, so I got to see a lot of different things on the ocean. I spent a great deal of my time there. But one of the trade-offs, which is I've seen over the past probably 10 years, is the loss of our our candlefish, which we call needlefish, which fed an awful lot of things in the ocean. And they basically disappeared about 4 years ago, and we haven't seen any, but they're starting to come back a little bit. Then we lost all our smelt, which kind of February fish, and they usually came in and spawned just about the time the herring were showing up. And one of the things we found that there wasn't that many smelt really to start with. But when the herring fishing started, they kind of took most of them, and I think they probably moved to someplace else. But we watched the trade-off on that part, and we saw the increase of the herring fishery, and it was still in the process of rebuilding from what it used to be. A long time ago, they had herring reduction plants throughout Alaska, which wiped out big portions of the herring. Some of the areas are still over 50 years and it still hasn't come back. Prince William Sound is probably going on to 30 years now. And part of that, and the trade-offs I've seen over the time is not that great. I don't know if I go any further.
Thanks, Harvey. I mean, a little bit, knowing your experience, that there was sort of a trade-off between, I would say, some of the commercial fishing activity going on and some of the subsistence use. And it makes me, sort of thinking about other regions, thinking about, well, there's lots of decisions that need to be made. In this case, maybe between subsistence and commercial fishing, but in, for example, the South Atlantic, there's a lot of trade-offs that you also face, Michelle, and I'm wondering, as you think about EBFM and your role in terms of implementing it, what are the challenges that you've seen and maybe some successes and lessons learned that you could share?
Thanks, Phil. Excuse me, appreciate the opportunity to sort of share some of the South Atlantic Council's story with the folks here today. And I think the Council has had a long history of using the types of tools that I think form what most folks would consider to be the foundation for moving towards an ecosystem-based fishery management approach. And a lot of that has been driven by the life history characteristics of the species that we have to manage in the South Atlantic. We have a lot of long-lived, slow-growing, late-to-mature and reproduce species. Our snapper grouper fishery is the largest, most complex fishery that we have. A lot of these critters do crazy things like change sex from female to male at some point in their life. These are socially mediated interactions, but I think one of the overarching things is that a lot of these species are very highly dependent on mixed hard bottom. And so we started from sort of a habitat perspective in the South Atlantic Council, and we looked towards prohibitions on the use of bottom damaging gear, rock hoppers, trawls, limitations on the use of longline gear in this fishery. And so that put us in a really great position when the 96 reauthorization of the Magnuson came out to move this into an overarching habitat plan that spanned not just the snapper grouper fishery, but all of our fisheries. And so after the 2006 reauthorization, this habitat plan actually formed the foundation for our very much first generation fishery ecosystem plan. When Tim showed the stack of papers, I have to sort of hang my head a little bit because the South Atlantic Council's Fishery Ecosystem Plan, and I do think it was probably one of the first ones developed by the regional councils throughout the country, is pretty hefty, but did a great job of compiling status, trends, threats of all of the council's managed species, but not just the managed species, but the prey for those species as well. And so, and I think as we are currently right now in the revision of that fishery ecosystem plan, we expect it to be completed at some point next year. We're very much looking forward to the tools that are coming out of the task force report, because that is one area where we've struggled is operationalizing EBFM. But I would say that looking at a couple of the examples in the South Atlantic where we've been able to move forward as a result of our fishery ecosystem plan, and try to acknowledge some of those trade-offs between social and economic factors and wanting to protect our habitats. Our very first comprehensive ecosystem-based amendment had to do with deep-sea corals. I know there's been a lot of attention on deep-sea corals lately. We have extensive Lophelia banks throughout the South Atlantic, and one of our first sort of stakeholder processes in that regard was working with a couple of our smaller fisheries, our golden crab fishery and our rock shrimp fishery, to once these Lophelia banks were identified, working with those industries through a pretty extensive 2-year-long stakeholder process to carve out allowable fishing areas for those industries. They weren't setting their gear on top of these very slow-growing old Lophelia banks, but in close proximity to them. So there were trade-offs there, and I think everybody came away very satisfied with the process. It was long, it was difficult, but everybody acknowledged that they came away satisfied. Nobody got everything that they wanted, and I think that's one of the big lessons here in regards to operationalizing ecosystem-based fishery management. And we also have moved further down that road in terms of the use of other spatial management tools such as deep water marine protected areas, which went in about the same time, and that was like a 10-year-long process to really get those in place. And I could probably go on forever, but I want to let's back to the Dr. Phil show. So.
Well, Tim, Michelle mentioned tools, so and you kept saying, "Oh, we have tools, we have tools." So now's your opportunity to prove it. So what I'm wondering is if you could maybe just give a suggestion of a tool perhaps that has would be very effective, is available now, but isn't being used enough in your judgment.
I think a lot of the sort of risk-based tools are, let me back up. I think that there's a tendency to delay taking action on an item if there's any sort of scientific imprecision. So rather than sort of do the sort of thought exercise of, well, what would more science really reveal, doesn't really necessarily make best use of the information that's on hand. And that information could be from people that really know the system. So you can do conceptual models, you can do things called Bayesian belief networks, and you can do all those types of things and get a pretty good handle pretty quickly. Not with the same type of precision of a quantitative stock assessment model, but it's trying to do something different. I think in terms of the policy side, one thing that really stood out to me is when we took a look at places where people had put in actual policies to reach ecosystem goals. So these are pre-negotiated rules for how decisions are going to be made based on system state. In every case, they weren't developed based on a very sophisticated calculation or model or gobs of data. Often it was sort of based on just reasonable rules of thumb. So the one example that I usually look at is the Alaska groundfish fishery cap on landings. At the time when they made that recommendation, they didn't have a big fancy ecosystem model, but what they did is they took all of the single species maximum sustainable yields for a bunch of years, they added them all up, they reduced it by some percentage, they said that's probably around there. And
That's
let's
what
implement that.
What he said.
Yeah. And then since then, though, they've done since the tools have been built, it turns out they were pretty close. So that was my big aha moment is sort of waiting to make decisions and delaying for the basis of science. Often there's a lot more knowledge out there.
Thanks, Tim. I think we are ready to bring out these microphones and open it up for some questions from y'all.
I know, I've heard the other story too.
That's the one that's
I don't know where the microphones are.
There's one over here. If you just raise your
Oh.
hand, there should be a microphone at either end.
They're around.
Hi, Becky Shuford with NOAA.
First, I want to congratulate all of you that were on the panel but also the group that pulled together this plan of recommendations, because I think it's a really important contribution to moving us forward. And also thank you for doing it to help provide some guidance and things for us to use as we try and do similar things. So you have recommendations, and as we know, there's fishery ecosystem plans that have been around for a while, but there's some guidance in terms of how to maybe do them a little bit more precisely or different. So how would you see sort of near-term and maybe mid-term implementation of some of the things that you've recommended here? What do you think that would look like, and how are the folks that would be doing this looking to embrace that and do that? And that's to anybody.
Oh, just real quick, from what I've seen, I've been paying a little bit of attention to the Bering Sea Fishery Ecosystem Plan, and what they're doing is very, very close to what we're doing. So the key things I see them doing is not only setting objectives, but they're doing a prioritization that's sort of obvious, that's clear that they're doing it, and using a lot of risk-based tools to do that. So I think that's a great positive step.
I just, basically in our community in Southeast Alaska, it'd be nice to see them maybe go away from the percentage that they are taking on their model. When they had it at a 10% take on the herring were increasing. But since then, they went to a sliding scale and moved it to 20%, and it seems like it's starting to take an awful lot. They're starting to target the older fish. I think that if they target across the species at a 10%, I think they'd be back to where they're improving the herring situation again. We've got a long ways to go before they get anywhere near the baseline of what it was. We've got probably about 8 communities that used to have herring, and they didn't have to come to Sitka to get the herring eggs for their subsistence need. Now Sitka is the only place that supplies all of these communities, besides the whole state of Alaska and a good portion of the United States. So they need to do something to take a look at that and maybe modify how they do it.
Michelle has it.
I was just going to say, in terms of the question specifically to implementation. I mean, so again, we're in the middle of the revision to our fishery ecosystem plan, but from some of the drafts that I have seen, there are specific objectives that are being. We have a bevy of writing teams that are working on the various chapters, and the council's been able to take a look at drafts of climate variability and I think food web dynamic connections chapters. And so there are very specific objectives that are being recommended in there by the writing team that the council will be looking at and giving final approval to. So I think that's one step that's slightly different than our first draft of a fishery ecosystem plan. And we've also had some processes occur within the council itself. We've had a visioning process for our snapper grouper fishery where we've gone through that same type of identifying your goals and objectives, going through a prioritization process that is somewhat quantitative, very open. So I think taking the lessons from that and applying that to our fishery ecosystem plan and being very specific within our upcoming amendments about how we are addressing those ecosystem objectives is how I see that moving forward.
So Becky, since you're the IEA coordinator, I should say something about that. That close to almost a decade ago, we identified IEA's integrated ecosystem assessments as the way to implement EBFM. And this looks basically the same steps that you had seen on IEA. Since you're so heavily involved with the California current one, maybe you could comment on that.
Okay. You're not supposed to, I'm the question asker. Yeah, so the truth is, IEAs, this process here, and lots of processes that we're engaged in are all based on the same ideas of this is how you make good decisions. So how can you have an ecosystem plan? And this was for us, I think this was the key thing is we review things and the question is, what's the plan? We see a description, but what's the plan? So in order to have a plan, whether you're doing it as an IEA, which is geared towards, I should say, it's not ecosystem-based fisheries management. The IEA is really focused on ecosystem management writ large, so across sectors, so not only fisheries, but other ocean use sectors. But either way, you have to figure out, well, what are the objectives? If you don't have objectives, how do you know when you're done? How do you know when you succeed? You need to have ways to measure your progress. So you need indicators. That's going to be common no matter what you're doing. And you also, and I think the hardest thing in the ecosystem world is to come up with reference points, either targets or limits. So how do you know when you've succeeded? How do you know when you've dropped too low? If you don't have those, then again, how do you know your performance? And so to me, they look similar. There's a lot of differences in the detail. But the reason they look similar is because it's the same way you would plan an airport or, you know, a wastewater treatment plant. You would do the same process. It's just about doing good management, I think.
That was the right answer. Thank you.
Thank you. You can't fire me anymore. That's the good news.
Can I ask my question now? My name is Tess Gears. I work with Oceana. And so I'm curious about this result of lacking prioritization of objectives across some of the case studies. And I'm wondering, it seems to be that there's a bit of a trend towards trying to put a numeric value on everything and then comparing it and feeling like we can come up with an answer through that. And so I'm wondering, maybe part of the difficulty in prioritizing objectives is that some of these things, we're really comparing apples to oranges, and it's difficult to compare different things and prioritize them when something can have a numeric value and other things just can't. And so I'm wondering if there's recommendations around that or thoughts about that.
I'll take a step. I completely agree that a lot of this. I think I lost my mic. Okay, all right. Yeah, this trend towards trying to get ever more precise quantification of things. In this case, you're absolutely right. I mean, you can't. How do you put a number value on, agency, things like that. Some of the examples that I've seen that are pretty good, use these semi-quantitative sort of methods. That you just say good, acceptable, very, very bad, and that sort of framework. But then you sort of can layer on various things. So you can, on top of that, you ask, okay, that's the outcome. So that's giving you on the vulnerability. What's the extent at which, how many people are affected by this? How severe is it reversible? So there's all sorts of questions you can ask, and you don't necessarily have to answer them with numbers. But there's plenty of businesses deal with this all the time. And sort of stealing from that literature is essentially kind of the approach we're recommending.
Anybody else want to?
I'll just say that in the South Atlantic for our snapper group provisioning process, we didn't use numbers at all to prioritize our objectives. We used a big, messy, sticky wall that we called it, and everybody had their colored dots, and they put dots next to those items that they felt were a high priority underneath each one of our 4 strategic goals. So it's a pretty messy way to prioritize, but it's non-quantitative, basically. And you can, I think as long as you have the ability to break things down into categories of objectives, that can help you as well.
I can't see.
Mike Gravitz with Marine Conservation Institute. So if I look at Table 1, where you kind of say which plans, which of these fishery management efforts, EBFM efforts, sort of checked off a bunch of different steps and processes that you would like them to do in theory, you look at this and you say, gee, the plan for Pacific sardines and the plan for Alaska groundfish, for the plans, are really the best, right? Because they get more check marks. And in the case of Alaska groundfish, well, I'm sorry, in the case of sardines, you even, sort of check off, did we make it? So I guess my question is, would I be right in assuming or understanding that these are complexes or species that are the best managed in the United States?
Can I answer?
Sure.
Okay.
And I'm not, it's not
from
a
an
trick
agency-
question. I'm not trying
Yeah.
to catch anybody. I'm just trying to see if, in fact, this lengthy, costly process is giving us, is still living up to the theory and giving us better fishery management, because at the end of the day, it's kind of what we want.
So Pacific sardines, recognize that's Cal Coffee. It's the longest data series that we have in the U.S. and one of the longest fisheries oceanography programs in the world. It seems to be a well-managed fishery. Populations go up and down. We know when to back off. It'd be nice if populations always stayed high, but they are very responsive to environmental conditions in the California current. So we consider that within fisheries and within NOAA, I think in the fishing community, as being an example of one that we're trying to manage appropriately. For our agency and for NOAA in general, the North Pacific Council, the way they're dealing with ecosystem issues, particularly in the Bering Sea, is the place we'd like to see every place get to. They're the only one that really has an operational OI for the system, no matter how it was derived. They've been dealing with that since the 70s, late 70s. They have an ecosystem committee on the council. They have a forage fish amendment's been in place since the late 80s. So you weren't the first.
Ecosystem plan.
Okay, they've had fisheries ecosystem plans. The Arctic one is a model. And I'm very heavily involved with the Central Arctic Ocean and how we're trying to work with 10 states to actually control future fishing there. And we keep looking back to what's happened within the North Pacific Council and how they've managed there. So for us, they're doing a great job. And they seem to be following virtually all the steps. I think they're actually prioritizing. Mm-hmm. It's just that this isn't necessarily obvious, but the council does, and the research plans, and the center does as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just have a quick follow-up? So that being said, why is it that in the Bering, for example, you've got all these marine mammal problems with populations that are declining, or the seabirds are turning up with lots of extra mortality? Something's going on, and I'm just wondering if this EBFM
that's
is
a
really
great question.
adjusting.
And recognizing that most of my career was dealing with stellar sea lions, I've asked the same question, and we've never resolved that, whether it's a localized depletion issue or whether something else is happening. But the goal that the council set was to manage the groundfish fishery. So for better or worse, that was their objective. And they managed to sustain that fishery since the 80s at very high levels. That 2 million OY, if they took the ABC out of that system, it'd be up to close to 3 million every year. What's happening to fur seals and sea lions in the western Aleutians now is not clear. But the council did implement ecosystem measures in the eastern Aleutians, and it appears that the population for stellars, for one reason or another, has leveled off and stabilized, maybe increasing again. So there are things there we don't understand. But for fisheries ecosystem plan, EBFM type work, they seem to have done a good job.
Say something.
Yeah, Michelle and Harvey.
So I just wanted to speak to that a little bit, and this is where I get to pick on Richard maybe,
Okay.
although if he agrees with me, maybe it's not picking. But I think, I think we would all agree that the North Pacific has done a great job in terms of trying to implement EBFM or implementing EBFM. And I would just say that not every region is the North Pacific. In the South Atlantic, we have a lot of
And I agree
data
with you.
limitations.
I know you're headed.
See, I'm not picking. I mean, this is a region that I think probably a lot of folks in the agency would agree is under-resourced. There are 3 fishery management councils that the Science Center has to deal with. And so even though there is ecosystem planning that's going on to try to ensure that the science that's being collected can serve multiple purposes, not all regions are in the same place as the North Pacific. And I think that's definitely one of the challenges that we face. We don't have quite the time series of data in the South Atlantic that the North Pacific enjoys, and from a fishery independent perspective, at least, definitely. And that's a place that we would certainly like to get to, and I think we're working to try to do that, and we're also trying to incorporate stakeholders into that data collection process and be as creative as possible and look towards things like, citizen science to help fill those data needs as well. I couldn't resist.
Good. I was waiting for that. So we have 8 councils, and they're all in different places. And we consciously, in developing the roadmap, recognize that. So we're not trying to force every one of the councils into the same mold. They're all evolving. They're all doing stuff. 5 of the 8 councils have FEPs. And your council has set the standard for how you deal with deep water corals. And I think the West Coast is really looking to you for guidance on how you deal with forage fish. So, every one of the councils is doing things, and we're just trying to get them all to move along and keep going. They're making progress.
Harvey?
I just wanted to point out that United States Fish and Wildlife Service, back in the 50s, did a study on fur seals that were migrating from the Pribilofs to California. I know a little about this because my dad was part of that study. When they did the study, the scientists finally realized that the older fur seals were breaking up the herring stocks to where the younger seals couldn't feed on them. So the younger seals were starting to starve and die, and this caused the population to stabilize at a point where the food source was sustaining just that level of fur seals. I say this because the food source is so important to all these species that we're talking about. Without the forage fish, we'll see some things that will drastically happen, and it's kind of scary.
Yeah, and just to sort of tie some of these threads together, and thinking about your question a little bit, it was interesting that you pulled out sardines and groundfish as the examples, because in those situations, they're fisheries targets, and the agency invests a great deal of money in monitoring those. So in terms of the checklist, one of the other blanks going across the rows was monitoring and evaluation section. In fact, I just read a paper this morning, because what else do I have to do? And they were looking at river restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest. They looked at 27,000 different projects. 6% of those actually had monitoring plans. And so the fisheries example is not really different than any other sort of conservation activities that we do. We do a good job of implementing things. We do a bad job of actually monitoring and evaluating and adapting. And so I think it's interesting that you pulled out the ones that we do. Where I think we could use more investment is those areas, those ecosystem metrics that are not fisheries targets. Yeah. And one way to do that, just feeding off of Harvey now, is traditional knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge out there, as Tim mentioned, that could be tapped into to help at least guide the development of efficient and cost-effective monitoring. So just to sort of tie some threads together. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. I'm Leah Carr with the Global Environment Facility. Thank you for the report and this interesting discussion. I was particularly pleased to see that you looked at ecosystem-based management in terms of not only the ecological, but also the governance and the socioeconomic aspects. And I wanted to ask you, what did you find in terms of how these plans looked at socioeconomics, whether they looked at jobs, contribution to GDP, seafood contribution, as well as the cultural significance? Thank you.
That's a great question. Phil can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't recall whether we kind of did a sort of a lens of the extent to which they maybe did the scoping on social and ecological. We did talk to a lot of economists and social scientists. in our little sort of traveling roadshow. What we heard is that historically there had been a lot of resistance to including their expertise in decision making for a wide range of reasons. Some of them has to do with the scale of their information tends to be very small, and it's hard to sort of scale that up to management. I think part of it's just inertia as well. There also was the sense that it's moving in some areas quite strongly. So so I don't have a good sense on to what extent the current FEPs did a good job of sort of documenting the social and ecological side. And maybe Phil can
I would
comment.
say Magnuson requires a certain attention to fishing communities and also equity issues. And many of the states, like for Alaska being one, has a large program focused on subsistence and data gathering around that. So depending on your region, there has been a reasonable attention to some social and cultural economic aspects. I would say, by and large, for whatever reason, I don't know, I mean, the economics is the one that kind of rises to the top, where there's been, I think, some of the broadest application. And that would be economics, both in terms of dollars, but also jobs and that sort of thing. I think with the rise of catch shares and some of the social and cultural and economic issues around those that are byproduct, perhaps unintentional, of consolidation, for example, there's a great group of anthropologists and other social scientists in NOAA and outside that have really starting to pay attention to some of the consequences of fisheries management for communities outside of just straight up economics. I would say that by and large, those have tended not to be included in FEPs, however, they're separate. So I think there is a window to really begin to think in a non-quantitative way and sort of this qualitative way that Tim was talking about, trade-offs between some of the ecological outcomes, some of the economic outcomes, and social and cultural. We have time for one more question. Anybody? Katie?
Hi. Katie, Oceana. So great that you have lots of existing information. Great that there's lots of tools that you can repurpose for stuff, but you still have to do them in addition to your regular day jobs, the things you have to do. So does NOAA, do the fishery management councils have the stomach for the conversation of, if we're going to spend more time doing this, we're going to not do something else because there's only so much time and money? And I feel like moving forward, there'll probably be increasingly less maybe money for things that have like the word ecosystem in them, maybe. So does that mean you have a conversation about if you're going to do this, you're not doing something else? And that seems like a hard conversation to have in terms of moving forward. So how do you have that? Or do you have it? Or have you had it already?
Are you finished? We're having that conversation. That's why it's taken us 4 years to get to the point where we have a policy and a roadmap. The councils are really nervous because of exactly that, and Michelle could comment on it, but we talked about this, and then the councils repeatedly, when it became more clear that this was real, this year when we started to roll out the roadmap, we really thought the councils needed to really buy into this. So we had two comment periods. And we've been talking to the councils all along the process, but now where we actually had something for them to review, we gave them an additional 45 days to review this, just them, before we ever went public with it. And then we went public finally, and we closed mid-October for the final comment period. So the councils had close to 3 months to make sure that there was an opportunity for the SSCs, for the council family itself to take a look at this and realize what we were talking about. And in the end, the bulk of the comments and the pain that we're getting from the councils is exactly that. We're asking them to do something else, and there's no more money coming in there. So how are they going to do that? So when we designed the roadmap, it was basically status quo funds. So the things we're talking about there, we think we can accomplish either with existing allocations of funds or with minor changes. For them, the biggest issue is probably not data gathering or decision making, it's having the staff to do it. And we've had this ongoing battle with the senators and the regional offices about one FTE to basically be the coordinator, to watch all this. And basically, in the end, I had to tell them, stop, we're going to do this. There's going to be somebody at headquarters that's going to be watching the whole thing, and we're going to figure out a way to fund it. And whether it goes with Kenrick, or whether it goes in another office is not clear, but we're going to have a person at headquarters that's actually going to be, this is their job, to make sure that people are doing this. In addition to the other people who are watching for it anyway. But the resource, big issue.
And I mean, just to speak to the council perspective, I mean, Richard's correct. The majority of the councils had a lot of concerns about the resources necessary to do ecosystem-based fishery management. And I think those concerns varied around the country based on where you were. I mean, I think, you know, folks in the North Pacific feel like they're doing a pretty good job of this already. There was concern about resources from the agency being devoted to additional FTEs when, you know, in some regions like the Southeast, you know, we feel like we are still limited in some of our very basic data collections that would inform not just, you know, ecosystem-based fishery management, but traditional fishery management as well. And in terms of having the hard conversations about what do you prioritize, I feel like in the South Atlantic, given some of the things that have been on our plate this year, we have that conversation every council meeting. But we do have at the end of every year, so at our upcoming December council meeting, that's exactly the conversation that we have during our Executive Finance Committee. We can't do everything all at once. And there's always, at least we've found out, one or two triage issues that we have to plan for, and they tend to be more along the lines of traditional Magnuson Act type of things that we have to deal with. So, you know, the fishery ecosystem plan process has been occurring somewhat in the background, given that it is scheduled to be finished up in March or June of this year. You know, that's when we're going to have another conversation about prioritizing how to spread this out amongst all of our fishery management plans. How do we operationalize it and acknowledge it and look to some of these other tools? We've heard a lot about some of the tools that are available, management strategy evaluation, things of that nature. And I really liked some of the examples that are being discussed within the task force report and the very conceptual nature of them. One of the things that we've talked about in the South Atlantic is trying to take advantage of some of that traditional ecological knowledge and do something that I think the Mid-Atlantic Council does, but having an annual fishery ecosystem or fishery performance report, I think you could use that as a mechanism to gather on an annual basis, particularly some of the social and economic factors that, you know, I hugely applaud the agency's socioeconomists for the efforts that they've made in recent years, because that information is included in every fishery management plan now. But to try to get that from the stakeholder perspective, not just collecting numbers from logbooks or things like that. But circling back around, yes, I feel like we have those hard conversations every council meeting, but we do it annually.
Thank you all. We're at the end of our hour. I really appreciate everybody being here and joining us. I'd like to thank the panelists, Harvey, Michelle, and Richard. Honestly, thank you. Adding your perspectives and insight to this discussion is really invaluable, and I really appreciate your participation. Tim and Phil, long road. You got it through the finish line. Thank you. It's been great. Also, a shout out to the Lenfest Ocean Program team, as well as my science colleagues who not only put this together, but do it every day, and so thank you all. On your way out, there are hard copies of the report and the executive summary on the table outside, or if you prefer to read online, lenfestocean.org/EBFM. And if you have any questions or want any more information about the program itself, leave your business card or obviously catch me. I'm happy to discuss it further. And if you have more questions for the panelists, or if you don't have more questions for the panelists, I invite you to join me for a reception right behind us. And again, thank you all for coming.